He was sitting on the floor. Not a chair. The floor. A billionaire. On the floor of his own office. Crying. $40 million. Gone. Not lost in the market. Not a bad investment. Stolen. By the three people he trusted most in the world. His business partner of 11 years. His CFO. His own attorney. The company had 48 hours before it would cease to exist. The staff, 230 people, had no idea. James Whitfield had built this company from nothing. From a folding table in a studio apartment. From a dream that took 17 years to become real. And in one night, three people he called brothers had taken it all. But here's what nobody expected. The man who would save it all wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a banker, wasn't a board member. He was the janitor. And you need to hear every single word of what happened next. James Whitfield did not grow up with money. He grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cleveland, Ohio. 4th floor. No elevator. His mother worked the overnight shift at a printing factory. His father had been gone since James was 4. Not dead, just absent, which James always said was somehow harder. By the time James was 12, he was making grocery lists, cooking dinner, and getting his younger sister to school on time. Responsibility wasn't taught to him. It was handed to him because there was nobody else to take it. He got a scholarship to study business, graduated near the top of his class, spent 7 years working for other people's companies, learning, watching, building what he called his invisible toolkit. Every system he studied, every mistake he witnessed, everything he would do differently when the time came. The time came when he was 31. He started Whitfield Solutions, a logistics and supply chain consulting firm, from a folding table in a 400-square-foot apartment. First client, a local restaurant owner who paid him $800 for a single project. James nearly cried when the check cleared. 17 years later, Whitfield Solutions employed 230 people across 4 offices. James had made the Forbes list twice. He'd been invited to the White House. He'd given the commencement speech at his old university. And through every single year of it, he had kept the same 3 people by his side. Marcus Hale, his college roommate, his co-founder, his business partner for 11 years. The man who had talked him out of quitting twice in the first year alone. David Chen, his CFO, hired in year 3. Brilliant with numbers, methodical. The kind of steady hand that balanced James's relentless forward momentum. Raymond Cole, his attorney. The man who had reviewed every contract, every deal, every acquisition for a decade. The man James called when anything felt wrong. These 3 men weren't employees. They were family. What James didn't know, what he had no reason to suspect, was that for the past 8 months, those 3 men had been quietly engineering a fraudulent asset transfer, moving company funds, forging authorizations, building a paper trail designed to look like James himself had approved every transaction. $40 million. Redirected, gone, and when it finally surfaced, not through an audit, not through a whistleblower, but through a single bank notification James happened to see on a Friday evening, the full picture arrived in under 2 hours, and his attorney had blocked his calls. His CFO had already cleaned out his office. His partner of 11 years had sent one text message, "I'm sorry." James drove to the office that night. He didn't call anyone. He didn't know who to call. He went to the only place that had ever felt truly his. He sat down on the floor of his corner office, surrounded by 17 years of everything he'd built, and he broke. What he didn't know was that someone else was in the building. Someone who had been in that building every single weeknight for 6 years. Someone who had mopped that exact floor more times than he could count. And that someone was about to say 3 words that would change James Whitfield's life forever. His name was Roosevelt Carter, 61 years old, 6'1", moved through buildings the way water moves through old pipes, quietly, efficiently, with the kind of purpose that comes from decades of showing up whether anyone noticed or not. Roosevelt had worked the overnight cleaning shift at Whitfield Solutions for 6 years. He knew every office, every corner, every person who stayed late and what they ordered when they did. He knew Mr. Whitfield's office always smelled like coffee and leather and whatever candle his assistant kept on the window ledge. He did not expect to find the man himself sitting on the floor at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday. Roosevelt stopped in the doorway. He didn't speak, didn't back away, didn't make the small, embarrassed noise most people make when they stumble onto something private. He just stood there, still, present. James didn't look up for a long moment. When he did, his eyes were raw. His face was the face of a man who had stopped caring what he looked like. "I'm sorry," James said automatically. You can come back. I'll be gone in a minute." Roosevelt looked at him for a moment. Then he leaned his mop against the wall outside the door. He walked into the office, pulled one of the guest chairs close, not behind the desk, not across the room, right there, a few feet away from where James was sitting on the floor. and he sat down. James stared at him. Long night? Roosevelt said. Not a statement. A question. Genuine. Simple. No performance in it. James let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for hours. Yeah, he said. Long night. Roosevelt didn't push. Didn't pry. He sat in that chair with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that silence is sometimes the most useful thing you can offer another person. And slowly, haltingly, the way a dam releases before it breaks, James started talking. He talked about the three men, about the transfers, about the texts he couldn't answer because he didn't know what to say, about the 230 people who would come in Monday morning not knowing that the company might not survive the week. He talked about the folding table, the $800 check, the 17 years. Roosevelt listened to every word. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer solutions, didn't say that's terrible or I can't believe it or any of the phrases people reach for when they don't know what else to do. He just listened. When James finally went silent, Roosevelt looked at him steadily. Can I ask you something? James nodded. That company, the one you built, is it still here? James frowned slightly. For now, but if I can't, is it still here? Roosevelt said again, gently, firmly. A pause. Yes, James said. It's still here. Roosevelt nodded. Like that was the only answer that mattered. Like everything else was secondary to that fact. And then Roosevelt said the three words. Roosevelt leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes on James. Then start again. 3 words. James stared at him. Roosevelt didn't blink, didn't soften it, didn't add a single word to explain or cushion what he'd just said. Then start again. Not it'll be okay. Not you'll get through this. Not those men were wrong, though they were. Just, the thing is still here. You are still here. Then start again. James put his face in his hands, and for about 30 seconds he cried harder than he had all night. Roosevelt sat with him through every second of it. When James finally looked up, Roosevelt was still there. I started over at 53, Roosevelt said quietly. Lost everything in the recession. House. Business I'd had for 12 years. Everything. James hadn't known that. He'd never asked. You had a business? James said. Landscaping company. 14 employees. Roosevelt paused. I cleaned offices for 8 years before I could start rebuilding. I'm not done rebuilding. He said it without shame, without the performance of resilience. Just as a fact. 61 years old and I'm still going, Roosevelt said. You're what, 48? 47, James said. Roosevelt made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Son, you've got decades. James looked at the man in the chair. This man who had mopped his floor 6 years without James ever learning his name. This man who had walked into a room full of grief and just stayed. James reached out his hand. James, he said. Roosevelt shook it. Roosevelt. James Whitfield did not sleep that night. He left the office at 2 a.m., drove home, and sat at his kitchen table until sunrise with a yellow legal pad, not a laptop. A legal pad, the same kind he'd used at the folding table 17 years ago. By morning he had 4 pages of notes. He called his personal attorney at 7 a.m., not Raymond Cole, a different one, a woman he'd met at a conference years ago and never needed until now. He explained everything. She told him he had options, more than he thought. He called his most trusted senior director at 8 a.m. and told her everything. Her response? Tell me what you need. He called a board member at 9 a.m. By noon, legal proceedings had begun. The legal process took 14 months. There were depositions, injunctions, forensic accountants, days in court that James described later as some of the hardest of his life. The full $40 million was not recovered. About $26 million was, through seized assets, civil judgments, and a settlement that James's attorney called the best possible outcome given the complexity of what had been done. But here is the part that matters most. Not one of those 230 employees lost their job. Not one. James worked without salary for 8 months to keep payroll funded. He sold his apartment, moved into a smaller place, cut everything that wasn't essential to keeping the company alive. And 18 months after that Friday night on the office floor, at a company all hands, meeting in the same building, James Whitfield stood at the front of the room and told his staff exactly what had happened. All of it. The fraud, the floor, the legal fight, the months of uncertainty. And he told them about Roosevelt. He told them the 3 words. And then he announced that Roosevelt Carter was being given a full equity stake in Whitfield Solutions. Not a bonus. Not a raise. Ownership. The man who saved this company deserves to own a piece of it, James said. That's not charity. That's accuracy. Roosevelt stood up when the room applauded. He looked like a man who had spent 61 years doing things right and was finally, being seen for it. The floor where a billionaire broke. and a janitor held the whole thing together with 3 words. After everything James Whitfield lost, $40 million, 11 years of trust, the 3 men he called brothers, the thing that brought him back wasn't a lawyer or a rescue package or a miracle turnaround strategy. It was a man named Roosevelt Carter who pulled up a chair and stayed. So here is what I want to ask you, and I mean this genuinely. Has anyone ever said something to you, just a few words, maybe even from a stranger, that completely changed the way you saw your situation? What were those words? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If stories like this one, about the people we overlook and the moments that rebuild us, are what you come here for, subscribe. That's exactly what this channel exists to find. Next time, a woman was told her small bakery had 2 weeks before the bank took it. What a 9-year-old boy did the very next morning made national news. Stay with us.